We're not usually in a building a room as large as this. There may have been some issues. I'm very glad to see that the room doesn't look empty, so welcome. Welcome especially to this, the next of our Leeds Cultural Conversations. The aim of the Cultural Conversations is to bring the research of the Centre for Culture and the Arts at Leeds Beckett University to the public, so that you know what we're doing. But also sometimes we really want to know what you think and how you might be able to contribute. And so we will be inviting questions and contributions at the end. I have to thank Leeds City Council for hosting this event as one of the partners of the Centre for Culture and the Arts. And I also want to thank our sponsors, Palgrave Macmillan, the publishers, who are mounting a campaign for the humanities, something that is, I think, very much needed. Now, normally it wouldn't be me standing here doing the introduction. The director for the Centre of Culture and the Arts is, in fact, Susan Watkins, to my left, and we felt that it was somehow inappropriate for her to have to introduce herself. That doesn't seem the right thing to do. And I haven't said who I am either, because that wasn't in my script. I'm Ruth Robbins, I'm Director of Research for Cultural Studies at Leeds Beckett. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Susan here to the stage. Susan Watkins is a Professor of English Literature and Director of the Centre for Culture and the Arts at Leeds Beckett University. She specialises in contemporary women's writing and feminist theory, 100 years since suffrage. We feel that this might be an important thing to note. And she's published very widely on these topics, including a book on 20th century women novelists, feminist theory into practice, and the Nobel Prize winning novelist Doris Lessing. She's also edited essay collections on scandalous fictions and on Lessing as well. And her most recent publication, if you're interested, is Volume 9 in the Palgrave series British Women's Writing, which covers the period 1945 to 75. She's currently writing a book about contemporary women's post-apocalyptic fiction. And she'll be speaking to us today on the topic of dystopia, apocalypse, and contemporary women's writing. So I hope you join me in welcoming Susan to the lectern.
Thank you, Ruth. Thanks, everyone. Can I just check that you can all hear me as well? Good, okay. And can you all see the slides? Lovely, okay. So, just to start us off, I thought that I would mention a recent interview in The Guardian in which Margaret Atwood claimed that I am not a prophet. Science fiction is about now. And the picture on the slide shows women dressing in handmade costumes. And they're doing that in order to protest in Washington against President Trump's policy change, removing support for Planned Parenthood organisations. So I guess this proves the point that the way that we imagine the future says a lot about the time of writing, but also that visions of the future can resonate many years after they were written. So The Handmaid's Tale was first published in 1985. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss why so many visions of the future are dystopian and apocalyptic. I'm also going to talk about the ways in which women writers, both some of those writing now and some from much earlier on, how have they contributed to this trend and transformed it? So to start with, I'd just like to ask you what you notice about these images, just to say who they all are. So it's Will Smith in I Am Legend, Denzel Washington in The Book of Eli, Tom Hardy in Mad Max Fury Road, and Andrew Lincoln in The Walking Dead. So anyone got any thoughts on any of those images? Right, absolutely. I was really hoping somebody would say that. So thank you. So yes, they're all men. And I wonder why it is that so many of these films and TV programs that are set in this apocalyptic future, why do they focus on men? Why is there this focus on men trying to survive, men trying to protect women, men trying to rebuild things the way they were before, and men who are nostalgic for the world before things changed. Seems to me that that's a real trend in our contemporary culture. And we can see this in fiction as well. So perhaps the best example of a novel that fulfills the pattern that I've just described is Cormac McCarthy's 2006 text, The Road, which was also filmed. As one reviewer put it, America is a grim, grey shadow of itself after a catastrophe. A man and his young son wander through this post-apocalyptic world, trying to keep the dream of civilization alive. So that idea of trying to keep civilization alive is something that really interests me. Why do people want to go back to what civilization was before? Maybe there was something in that civilization that caused the apocalyptic event in the first place. Maybe we don't want to just repeat ourselves. So the focus of The Road, both the novel and the film, is very much, I think, on the father-son relationship. It's about whether that will survive. And that relationship, in a sense, becomes the emblem of civilized values. So it's about the survival of a notion of what it means to be human and how that is preserved in the strong relationship between father and son. And again, the mother figure exists only in flashback, only in the memories of the protagonist. And we actually learn that she chose to commit suicide when she knew that the world was going to be drastically changed by this apocalyptic event. She chose to commit suicide rather than face what was to come. So, Claire Colebrook has come up with the term sextinction. And if we think about it, it's obviously a composite word, isn't it? Mixing up the two words, sex and extinction. She uses this as a term which she uses to help describe the fact that imaginative visions of the end of the world can't seem to move beyond what she refers to as tiring gender narratives. So the full quote, she says, "It's precisely here in the genre of the post-apocalyptic that the most tiring gender narratives are repeated. One might say that it's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism than it is to think outside the structuring fantasies of gender. There must always be an active male heroism driven by a feminine fragility that appears to hold the promise of the future." And it's this also that interests me about the dystopian and post-apocalyptic imagination. Why does it tend to rely on these tiring gender narratives? And how are women writers perhaps moving beyond such tiring narratives? So this is the structure of the remainder of the talk, an outline of what I'm going to be covering. So first of all, I'm going to talk about contexts. What is it about our world now that is such fertile soil for the dystopian and apocalyptic imagination? Then I want to spend some time thinking about genre, exactly how to describe what sort of fictions these are. Then I want to look at the tradition of women's work in this field, because it doesn't actually come from nowhere. And of course, that involves talking about Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale. Where does that book come from, and which texts is Atwood herself trying to rewrite? I'd like to ask us to think about why dystopia is so popular with young adult readers right now. There's lots of you in the audience, so why is it so popular with you guys? And I'm also planning to talk about some more recent apocalyptic fiction by women writing now. And finish up by talking about this thing called posthumanism. How do our conventional ideas of what it is to be human change after the apocalypse? And lastly, what happens to writing and culture and society after an apocalyptic event? So thinking then about contexts, what's happening now that explains the popularity of the apocalyptic and dystopian mode? Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher and cultural critic, argues that humanity is now living in what he calls the end times. In his book of the same name, he claims that global capitalism is on its last legs for 4 reasons. He's referring there to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which the Bible talks about in the book of Revelation. And in the Bible, the 4 horsemen are plague, war, famine, and death. That's how the Bible imagines the end of the world. But Zizek argues that the 4 things that will bring the world as we know it to an end are climate change, biogenetic change, how biology is being shaped by science, and the unequal distribution of food and water, as well as wider social inequalities. So he says the underlying premise of the present book is a simple one. The global capitalist system is approaching an apocalyptic 0 point. Its 4 riders of the apocalypse are the ecological crisis, the consequences of the biogenetic revolution, imbalances within the system itself, problems with intellectual property, forthcoming struggles over raw materials, food and water, and the explosive growth of social divisions and exclusions. So this idea that we're living in the end times, which we can take from his book, is one that's, I think, quite pervasive at the moment. Another way of thinking about our present moment is to think about it in terms of this idea of the Anthropocene. So Dipesh Chakrabarty argues that our present moment can be characterized by using this term, Anthropocene. He says it's no longer a question simply of man having an interactive relation with nature. This humans have always had. Now it's claimed that humans are a force of nature in the geological sense. Humans, thanks to our numbers, the burning of fossil fuel and other related activities, have become a geological agent on the planet. Because humans constitute a particular kind of species, they can, in the process of dominating other species, acquire the status of a geologic force. Humans, in other words, have become a natural condition, at least today. So this term, Anthropocene, anthropo means human, scene means recent geological period. What he's arguing, I think, is that as a species, we're responsible for changing the natural world around us in ways that cannot be undone. And there is a huge debate in response to Chakrabarty's idea about whether all humans are equally responsible. So is it just those in the first world, those who are relatively privileged in our world, who are responsible for this kind of change? How can we say that the less privileged, the minorities in our society, can be blamed for that kind of change? So those are some of the kind of contexts which I think explain why this dystopian and post-apocalyptic way of writing and thinking is so popular at the moment. Moving on now to define these kinds of works. Are they best characterized as dystopian or apocalyptic or even post-apocalyptic? So Andrew Tate, in his book Apocalyptic Fiction, argues that critical readings frequently emphasize 2 basic shapes for nightmarish, ruined future fictions. The first, frequently referred to as dystopia, is a world dominated by technology and excessive consumerism that generates endless leisure for a decadent ruling elite and misery for a vast, starving underclass. This kind of society, covertly run by shady bureaucrats who work for corporations rather than for a democratically elected government, is rarely represented as a happy end of history. The alternative vision, he says, is of a devastated Earth, in which this techno-future has failed and life is simply a brutal struggle, eked out by the survivors. So I guess he's distinguishing between 2 kinds of apocalyptic writing. One which focuses on the idea of dystopia, this kind of unequal future in which some are very powerful and have all the resources and some have none, And then the other kind of apocalyptic fiction is this post-apocalyptic one, where even a dystopia has broken down and all that's left is a tiny remnant of humanity trying to survive. Also, an interesting book if any of you want to explore this apocalyptic fiction book by Tate, because it talks about the religious traditions that lie beneath these apocalyptic visions. So for me, the features of the post-apocalyptic novel are as follows. What tends to happen is that the world before the disaster is in living or cultural memory. The disaster has been quite clearly caused by human carelessness for the environment, by the unchecked excesses of technoscience, and by capitalist exploitation of natural resources. And what tends to be the focus of the narrative is either a kind of nostalgia for the past and an attempt to recover what's been lost, or alternatively, on taking the chance to rebuild in a very different way. The critics Baccalini and Moylan also make this distinction between what they call the critical dystopia as opposed to the classical dystopia. I mean, obviously, on one level, dystopia is just the opposite of utopia. A utopia is an imaginary place or condition in which everything is as bad as possible. But Baccalini and Moylan make this distinction between the critical dystopia, which is traditionally a bleak, depressing genre with little space for hope within the story. They argue that classical dystopias, if they have hope at all, have it outside the pages of the text. On the other hand, they say there are some dystopias which can be called critical dystopias because they allow readers and protagonists to hope by resisting closure. They also continue on to say that such critical dystopias maintain the utopian impulse within the work. And here, I guess, we could think about something like The Handmaid's Tale as a critical dystopia with its open ending, where we don't know what happens to Offred, and where it is possible that there's a good outcome, but there also might not be. So the utopian impulse is present there in the text. Atwood also comes up with this word, ustopia, which I think is a great term. She says, it's a word I made up by combining utopia and dystopia, the imagined perfect society and its opposite, because in my view, each contains a latent version of the other. So she's kind of thinking about how maybe one person's dystopia is another person's utopia. It depends on the perspective. And she's also talking about how, as a genre, these things get very mixed up. So, there's actually a long tradition of women writing in the dystopian and utopian genre. So you probably haven't heard of some of these texts on the slide. You might have heard of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's book, Herland, which was first published in 1915. So the book describes an isolated society composed entirely of women. They reproduce via parthenogenesis, asexual reproduction, and the result is an ideal social order which is free of war, conflict, and domination. Although, of course, things do change when 3 men arrive into this society. Less familiar is Rokeya Sakawat Hossein's Sultanas Dream, published in 1905. The word sultana here means female sultan or ruler. Hossein was a Muslim Bengali writer, and she writes about a feminist utopia called Ladyland, in which women run everything, and men are the ones who are secluded and put into purdah, in a mirror image of the traditional practice where women were secluded from public life. In this country, the book Gloriana, or The Revolution of 1900, was written by Florence Dixie, who was a campaigner for the vote for women. As a girl, her heroine, Gloriana de Lara, dreams of the day when women will no longer be second-class citizens, will be able to vote, and can aspire to any career open to men. She makes a solemn vow in front of her mother that she will make her dream reality or die trying. And Australian author Katherine Helen Spence similarly imagines life in 1988 from her point of writing in 1888. And I'd like to thank two PhD students in the School of Cultural Studies and Humanities at Leeds Beckett, Danielle Hall and James Collinge, whose research brought some of these examples to my attention. So those are some of the really early forebears of this tradition of women's dystopian and apocalyptic writing. More recently, I've been working on the period 1945 to 1975, which is rather a neglected one in terms of women's writing, but it's actually one in which women's science fiction, dystopian and apocalyptic fiction was really flourishing. So you might have heard of Angela Carter and Doris Lessing on the slide, but perhaps not the first three writers. So some of the texts that I include in this chapter in my book, The History of British Women's Writing, 1945 to 1975, are people like Margot Bennett, who published a book called The Long Way Back in 1954. Jacketta Hawkes, Providence Island, came out in 1959. And Anna Kavan's Ice, which is slightly more well known, was published in 1967. Now that book, Kavan's Ice, imagines a huge ice age overtaking the world. But at the same time, it's about a man's obsessive search for a woman. He kind of follows this woman from country to country, all the while the ice is encroaching. And by the end of the text, the ice has taken over to the extent that, everything is going to be destroyed. But it also means that no one else can have this woman that he's been obsessively following throughout the book. So the end of the world also seems to suggest a kind of logical outcome, if you like, for misogynistic stalking, which is slightly disturbing. Okay, so if we get on to The Handmaid's Tale, which of course we have to discuss here, we have to acknowledge the importance of this novel. First published in 1985, last year made into a TV series, and I gather that Series 2, which takes us beyond the ending of the book, will screen on Hulu in April in the US. Not sure what the plans are for screening it in this country yet, but I'm sure we will get it, maybe in the autumn. So Atwood thinks of herself, I think, as writing what she refers to as speculative fiction. She says, what I mean by science fiction is things that could not possibly happen. Whereas for me, speculative fiction means things that really could happen, but just hadn't completely happened when the authors wrote the books. So this comes from her collection of essays called In Other Worlds, Science Fiction and the Human Imagination. So basically what she's saying is that, stories that imagine interplanetary warfare with the lizard men from Xenor, that's science fiction. Whereas there's a tradition of writing that she calls speculative, meaning technological innovation or cultural and social change that hadn't completely happened when the authors wrote the books. She also very famously said that in her speculative fiction, she hasn't included anything that hasn't happened somewhere in the society around her at the time of writing. Now, Atwood also wrote a piece for The Guardian about how influenced she was by George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. She says, in the latter half of the 20th century, two visionary books cast their shadows over our futures. 1984, with its horrific vision of a brutal, mind-controlling totalitarian state, and Brave New World, which proposed a different and softer form of totalitarianism, one of conformity achieved through engineered bottle-grown babies and hypnotic persuasion, rather than through brutality, of boundless consumption that keeps the wheels of production turning. She says, would it be possible for both of these futures, the hard and the soft, to exist at the same time, in the same place? And what would that be like? So I would argue that The Handmaid's Tale is a kind of reworking and mixture of Brave New World and 1984. She says it herself here, you know, would it be possible for both of those futures to exist in the same place, and what would that be like? She also explains in the bottom quotation how she transformed 1984 and Brave New World by rewriting them from the female point of view. She says the majority of dystopias, Orwell's included, have been written by men, and the point of view has been male. When women have appeared in them, they have been either sexless automatons or rebels who've defied the sex rules of the regime. I wanted to try a dystopia from the female point of view, the world according to Julia, as it were. And Julia is the heroine of 1984, but we see her very much from the hero's perspective. So what she's tried to do in The Handmaid's Tale is take Julia's point of view and write from that. So in The Handmaid's Tale, the focus is on reproduction rather than production. And even though the heroine of Fred does defy the sex rules of the regime, as Atwood puts it, we're not sure where that leaves her at the end of the novel. Okay, so I'm interested in why dystopian visions that draw on Atwood's ideas are so popular right now with young adult readers. I think that if we consider the huge popularity of things like Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games trilogy, Veronica Roth's Divergent series, we can see how they are drawing on some of what Atwood's done before. And they're incredibly popular. And I'm not sure what I think about these books and films. Arguably, they do focus on female protagonists as the heroic central figures. Arguably, they're beginning potentially to challenge the idea of woman as victim. But I'm just not really sure whether that is an actual successful enterprise, whether they really achieve much in terms of rewriting and transforming how women are seen in this genre. So I'm looking at some different contemporary texts that are post-apocalyptic by women writing now. These are just 4 of the interesting novels that I'm working on at the moment. So one of them is by Lionel Shriver, best known perhaps for her novel which became a film, We Need to Talk About Kevin. Shriver's The Mandibles, A Family 2029 to 2047, follows the fortunes of this American family called the Mandibles as they attempt to cope after the economic and social collapse of the USA. Who Fears Death is a 2010 novel by the Nigerian-American novelist Nnedi Okorafor. This book is set in a post-apocalyptic Africa in the Seven Rivers Kingdom that used to be part of the Kingdom of Sudan, where there is entrenched violent tribal conflict. And it's about how the heroine kind of accesses her magical powers and begins to transform the world around her. The novel won the 2011 World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. Emily St. John Mandel's book, Station 11, was published in 2014. Mandel is a Canadian novelist who sets her book amongst a troupe of strolling players who perform Shakespeare's plays across the settlements of a North America devastated 20 years previously by a flu pandemic. So it's partly about how Shakespeare might survive. It's also about how a comic book, a graphic novel, might survive and what those different texts might do in the post-apocalyptic moment. That book won the 2015 Arthur C. Clarke Award, which is an award for science fiction writing, and the Toronto Book Award. And of course, Margaret Atwood has recently returned to the speculative mode in her recent trilogy of post-apocalyptic fictions. Called Maddam, these 3 novels are set after a genetically engineered virus has wiped out almost all of humanity. So this is the Maddam trilogy. It's made up of Oryx and Crake, The Year of the Flood, and the final volume, which is also called Maddam. Now, some of you will have noticed that the word Maddam is a palindrome. And a palindrome is a word that reads the same backwards and forwards. So if you just think about that for a moment, you can see that it does. So if you read it from the end to the front, it's the same as it is the right way round, as it were. And I think the fact that she's given the collection this palindromic title is an important clue to how we should read it. In this trilogy of novels, Atwood deals with the end of human civilization after a widespread flu pandemic. But at the same time, she also talks about the creation of a new humanoid species called the Quakers. The Quakers are named after their creator, who genetically engineers them, and he's also the same person who deliberately creates the fatal flu virus. So he kind of kills off almost all of humanity, but also, godlike, generates this new species called the Quakers. And what happens at the end is that the remnants of humanity, the ones who have survived the pandemic, learn to coexist, reproduce, and survive with this small group of Quakers. So they start having babies together, they start living, they start making a new culture. Maybe the beginning is in the end is in the beginning, hence the palindromic title. So, many of the novels I'm talking about in the project that I'm doing right now deal with this question of how humanity might change after an apocalyptic event. How might the human have to become the post-human or the post-apocalyptic? Now, the slide here shows a sketch by Leonardo da Vinci of the ideal proportionate human. And I just wondered if any of you, again, have any comments about this particular sketch. Anybody? Okay, someone said it's a man, someone said yes. So the ideal human body, according to Da Vinci, is a male one. And he's modelling this drawing on what's called the canon of proportion, which is based on the correlations of ideal human proportions, supposedly, with geometrical relationships, as described by the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, hence it's called Vitruvian man. But what about women and women's bodies? Of course, women's bodies have never conformed to this masculine ideal of what it is to be human. And here we can see that point being made in a kind of reworking of the Vitruvian man sketch of Da Vinci. This is a painting called New Vitruvian Woman by Jim Dowdalls. And here he uses the female body as the basis for his conception of what it is to be human. You might also notice that running along the back is a kind of sketch of DNA and the double helix sequence that forms our DNA. So there's an interesting point there being made about, I suppose, biology and science and the body. And then, of course, we can take it even further. This joke Vitruvian cat magnet adds to our questions about how we define the human. It's a spoof and it's funny, but it's maybe making a point. You know, in the past, ideas of the ideal human were male, they were masculine, they were chauvinist, they excluded women. They didn't see any continuity or similarity between humans and animals. And that, of course, allowed the justification of the exploitation of women and animals. So I guess the question is, what's come to be known as posthumanism asks us to reconsider, how can we reconsider our conventional ideas of what it means to be human? So how can we rethink the idea of the human in a post-apocalyptic moment? How might the human be altered by things like technology, digital and social media, by climate change, by what will happen to all those things after an apocalyptic event? Donna Haraway famously refers to our kinship or relation with animals and machines. She says we should not be afraid of our joint kinship with animals and machines. In a changing world, we can no longer consider ourselves to be superior to animals and machines. So maybe some of the most interesting post-apocalyptic fiction is actually trying to get us to question how that notion of the human might transform and might become more questioned and more open to diversity at the end, after an imagined apocalyptic future scenario. So, the final question I'd like to ask in this talk is, what happens to writing after the apocalypse? So I've been looking in my research at how a number of these novels deal with the question of whether literature and written culture might survive after the apocalyptic event. And what I'm finding in my work into contemporary women's writing about the apocalypse is that nearly all women writers do imagine writing surviving, but they also imagine it changing after the end of the world as we know it. So they imagine the persistence of literature and writing, but they also imagine its transformation. None of them are nostalgic for the past. None of them are concerned to preserve earlier literature in like a time capsule. Instead, they are all about embracing change and transformation in the written word, literature, and culture. And this gives us a clue, I think, to how they see society and culture moving on post-apocalypse. In some almost contradictory way, they suggest positive futures for humanity after the apocalypse. What was so great about the past? It caused the apocalypse. Why not rebuild in a new way, rather than yearning for the past and attempting to refashion human civilization in the same way as it was before? So what they end up suggesting, I think, is that society and culture can be transformed and revised in just the same way as literature and writing can also be revised. So what I hope to have shown in this talk is how women's writing within this tradition of dystopian and apocalyptic writing forms a kind of tradition, but also how it revises and reworks the masculine tradition, and how it also nods to foundational texts such as The Handmaid's Tale. Thanks very much. I think there's going to be a Q&A now, when I get the chair back for...
Yeah. We sort of realised that this might not be the ideal space for a Q&A, but we're going to have a go, because
Yeah.
this is what you have to do. So what I think we're going to do is that if you can't shout loud enough, I will come and listen to you and shout up.
Do it.
So,
okay.
So if you have questions...
Raise your hand and Ruth will come down. The only thing she doesn't have is a roving mic, unfortunately. I don't think this is at all rovable.
Thanks for that lovely talk. That was actually a very fast hand went before raised. Thinking a little bit about the young adult dystopian fiction.
Yeah.
I've noticed that there is a trend now to have the female protagonist in these books. But that female protagonist is the question of whether or not she is embodying a new idea of female protagonist, or in fact if she is restricted by the male ideas of the hero, in that they are now becoming violent and aggressive and just coarse, and whether you think that is perhaps a birth of a new female concept, or if it is that actually the new female protagonist hasn't been created yet.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think what you have pointed up there is why I was so equivocal when I was talking about that slide, because I do think it's a good first step that at least we have got women characters, kicking ass, so to speak. But I also think that is very limited. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a step on a journey. It's a first step, and we would want to get to something more interesting quite quickly, please. And I think that some of the books I'm looking at are actually doing more interesting things. The reason why those particular texts have been picked up and filmed is because they're not quite as interesting as others. So they fit with, I suppose, Hollywood conventions to an extent. they're just tweaking at the edges of them. So I guess that's I'd like to see something, more challenging eventually emerging, and I think it will, because it's emerging in literature, and eventually, hopefully, cinema will pick that up too, and TV as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you were talking about the books that were published and the popularity of these new films, I kept thinking about the Harvey Weinstein example, where, yes, that's okay, but it's still controlled by a matriarchal society. So it's like the males have given permission for the women to write these books, but they're still in charge of publishing them. Have you just kind of researched into that?
So you're thinking about how the publishing industry works? Yeah. Well, I think that there's a lot of online and digital and social media publication now, which allows, obviously it's got its problems also, but it allows a lot more new work to come out outside of those constraints of the commercial publishing industry. Interestingly, Atwood is an example of somebody who, one of her most recent novels, which I didn't mention today, it's called The Heart Goes Last. That's also, I think that appeared first on kind of like some kind of social media site. Obviously she's an exception because she's, a prize winning, she can do what she likes, etc. But I do think that there's some scope, at least, for people writing outside the commercial publishing industry to get their voices heard through those channels.
On the topic of young adult dystopian limiting the female protagonist, I was just wondering about how much of an emphasis is put on relationships in terms of like the female protagonist finding love, and often like debating between, which pretty boy is she going to choose? Is that like also limiting the female protagonist in that sense?
Yeah, I think that's another problem with it. And if you read something like Atwood's Maddam trilogy, you'll find in the second volume especially there's a real focus on women's relationships with each other. So it's not, all the women have relationships with men, but those relationships are quite clearly quite exploitative. After the apocalyptic event, they have to be resourceful and support each other as women, and actually that proves a way in which they can, rebuild after the apocalyptic event. So I suppose I'm suggesting that in that instance as well, there's more interesting stuff going on than there is in some of the films and the film versions of things that are really popular at the moment. So I'd say, read the Maddam trilogy and enjoy.
There's one there, I think, and then one here and one there, and that might cover the time we have.
Okay, well, let's see.
Do you think that female writers in particular are still trapped in the male gaze style of writing women, so that when we have an end of the world situation, women resort to these stereotypes that have been entrenched in society?
Sorry, just say the bit about the gaze again.
So the male gaze is
Yeah.
so entrenched in society that even female writers cannot escape it.
Right. No, I think they can escape it, and I think they're starting to in some of the texts I've looked at. Not all of them, but some of them. It's there usually as something that's being acknowledged and described and written about. But it's something that also, for example, like I said, relationships between women that are kind of quasi-maternal or sisterly, that involve friendship and bonding, all of that is taking place in some of these texts as a kind of way of, I suppose, reworking and thinking beyond the male gaze and patriarchal relationships that have structured society before the apocalypse. So yeah, I think there is positive stuff going on in the literature that I've examined, yeah.
Yeah, well basically, I know she's usually defined as a crime writer, but would you say the novel Children read by Billy James can be classed as what you class as contemporary post-apocalyptic, because, like you see, the symbol Poe being a pregnant woman?
Absolutely, and I don't know if everyone knows this novel or the film version of it. It's called Children of Men. P.D. James is better known as a crime writer, as you said. So what happens in that is that that no children can be born. And this is a thing that obviously you see partly in Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. We see it also in this really well-known, successful novel called The Testament of Jessie Lamb by Jane Rogers, which I would really recommend to anyone who's interested in this type of writing. It's the same scenario. So in that last novel, The Testament of Jessie Lamb, there's this genetically engineered virus which causes maternal death syndrome, which means that pregnancy becomes fatal. So women cannot have live births, children stop being born, etc. And these 3 novels, I think, if you include The Handmaid's Tale, we could describe them under the umbrella demo dystopias. So dystopias to do with fears about climate change and population numbers, either massively going up, there are some like that, or massively going down. So in the case of Children of Men, absolutely, I do think it can be seen as fitting in this genre. And also the fact that you end with the pregnancy and hopefully the escape of the pregnant woman into a more, better society. That is another way in which we see some hope for the future in this genre. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you spoke a lot about male and female stereotypes, specifically about post-apocalyptic stuff that's happened before. In the context of female writers, I wondered if they've discussed gender fluidity at all, or whether it's most important that, the writer identifies female, or how much that's writers are playing in that area.
Okay, well, I suppose the example I think of there is something like Jeanette Winterson's The Stone Gods. Ooh, I'm losing my slides now, it's too late. But something like Winterson's The Stone Gods is very much interested in exactly that. So she imagines a kind of it's difficult to describe, but yes, it's an issue in that novel especially. I do think you're right that actually it's about transforming patriarchy in a lot of these texts. So gender fluidity is perhaps not as prominent as you might expect or wish for, actually. But it does depend what text you look at. There are some that do address that question, yeah. And she's one example.
Just wondering, a little bit thinking about that, was where you saw Ursula Le Guin, who died in
Yeah.
that, and she has sort of touched on that in some of her books, but I wondered what you thought about her.
What I think about Ursula, I love Ursula Le Guin, and The Left Hand of Darkness it's not so much a post-apocalyptic, and I think she's more science fiction than speculative fiction in terms of Atwood's distinction, although she's probably both. But The Left Hand of Darkness, it imagines a planet where people only become sexed biologically when they are fertile and then reproduce and then go out of chema, it's called, and they don't have any sex unless they are about to have sex with somebody and reproduce. So the changes that she imagines happening in that society as a consequence are quite interesting. One of the things she talked about in relation to that is the problem she had with pronouns. So how is she going to avoid he and she as pronouns? At that point in the 70s, I think The Left Hand of Darkness came out. I don't think culture had really got much beyond cisgender pronouns. So that's a kind of technical problem which the book doesn't really get over very well. But in terms of making you think about sex, gender and sexuality, it is a really good read, definitely. I don't think it's post-apocalyptic though, because it's all on just like this other planet, that's part of a galaxy kind of thing. So it's more science fiction-y. It's a good question. Yes, in one of my chapters I talk about trauma and about I suppose my argument is that we tend to think of the apocalypse as traumatic, but for women, present day life is quite traumatic. So, actually, maybe that's a kind of exaggerated way of making a point, But I think that's the point that a lot of women's post-apocalyptic fiction makes. So in a sense, you know, it's the question that, again, one of my colleagues, Caroline, has asked me before, whose apocalypse is it? You know, so maybe some people now are living in a world which to them is apocalyptic because they're disadvantaged, because they're, you know, minoritized, because they have no power and freedom. So the question of trauma is, I think it is central, and I think what lots of the literature I'm looking at argues is precisely that it's the world before the apocalypse that's traumatic, actually, and that the new world after the apocalypse could be a creative opportunity to move beyond that trauma. So I suppose I'm saying that I think they do move beyond it when you're saying perhaps that they don't.
Any more for any more? Well, she's having another go. Can you all go first, and then she can have another go? You go first.
I haven't actually done a survey myself. Would you say that there are more apocalyptic titles around now than there used to be?
Yeah.
Raised on a diet of pulp science fiction by my dad, and it doesn't seem like that to me. It just seems it's just different.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, other than literally counting them all, it would be very difficult to prove. I think you get a resurgence of apocalypticism at century ends, millenniums, etc. So I think the fact that we were around leading up to and after the year 2000, I think there was a big trend in it that probably the same around 1900. I'm sure Ruth would agree. So, but yes, I think it's a continual thing. But and you would have to literally kind of count all the texts, wouldn't you, in order to prove it, which I haven't done. But my sense is that the culture at certain key moments, usually to do with the end, a perceived end of century or millennium or whatever, does turn to that more. There was someone over there next to the, yes, you. Sorry, Liz, I know you, Liz, so I'm not letting you have another question. Yeah.
So I don't know if it fits in the genre of science fiction or dystopia, but I thought that the power...
Yeah, the power.
It changed, I think one of the earlier books you mentioned, it was like when women took power in the earlier books, it was really lovely. Whereas in the power, when women got power, there were all these different dynamics where it was completely opposite. So I've not read a lot of this. Is that a new theme now, or is it like a new approach to science?
Okay, so I don't know if everyone knows this. It's Naomi Alderman's book, The Power. It was, I think I read it last Christmas and it hadn't been long out. So not this Christmas, the one before. So it's quite recent. I think there's a tradition of imagining everything reversed. So you take a patriarchy and you make it into a matriarchy. You make men the ones that stay in the domestic sphere and women the ones in the public sphere. What she's done is give women violence and give women actual, literal, physical power over men, which is interesting because I don't think I've quite seen that before in anything. The questions that derive from that, for me, are more to do with the framework for that novel. So the stuff to do with how it's envisioned as something, it's to do with the time framing of it, isn't it? Like, when did this happen? How does it make us rethink history? How does it make us rethink how we judge historical artifacts? Because she has some line drawings of statues and things and kind of gets us to think, well, what if we thought about that in a different way? So it's not a straightforward narrative in terms of time sequence. It's not like, oh, there's this apocalyptic event and then this happens. Or it's not just that this is a future reimagining. It's also, was this something that happened years and years and years ago in the past? So for me, what interests me about that is the time framing of that and how she constructs that. And I thought that was really interesting. Probably haven't quite answered your question there, but sorry.
Okay, I'm going to draw us to a close. She'll hang round for a moment or two afterwards if anybody wants to ask a quiet question. That's allowed. But will you join me in thanking Susan for a really fascinating...
Thank you. Thanks for coming.